It has to be a kind of revolution in the way we eat, a revolution that is not only limited to ham consumption, but to meat, to vegetables, and so on and so forth. It's not only a question of the type of additives you're using, but on the way you're processing the meat, on the way you're transporting the meat, eating the meat, and so on and so forth. And if you don't change this kind of habit, you will just find a bad fix, and you will replace nitrite by another stuff that might not be better than nitrite.
Welcome to Beyond the Fix. This is a podcast that takes a closer look at the solutions that science and technology aim to offer to today's most pressing problems. In this episode, we're exploring the topic of nitrites and processed meats. Things like charcuterie, sausages, ham, bacon, and the like. Processed meats are almost always made using nitrite curing salts, known as Nitrite Perkel salts in German or sel de salaison nitrite in French. It's this compound that, through various chemical reactions in the body, can form nitrosamines, which are carcinogenic. In fact, it's classified as a Group 1 carcinogen by the WHO. In 2023, the European Food Safety Authority raised concerns about the health risks of nitrosamine exposure for all age groups across the EU. And yet, despite the clear links to colorectal cancer, a major concern given its position as the second leading cause of death in France, for example, there doesn't seem to be much public debate on the subject in Switzerland and most other countries, with the notable exceptions of France and Denmark. It's time we discuss this in detail. My guest today is Jérôme Santolini, a biochemist and director of research at the Institute for Integrative Biology of the Cell at University of Paris-Saclay, as well as the head of the Oxidative Stress and Detoxification Laboratory. He was a scientific member of the French Regulatory Agency's working group dedicated to the use of nitrites in industrial foods, whose advice served as a guideline for the French government ruling in the case of nitrites in meat preservation. As a scientist activist, he is board member of Sciences Citoyennes, an organization engaged in the democratization of science and active in the French scientist rebellion movement. I'm looking forward to hearing your insights. Welcome to the show, Jérôme.
Well, thank you, Thomas.
So I would like to start with some practical questions. I'm trying not to eat too much meat, but I love bacon, charcuterie, sausages. So from your perspective, would it be better for me to stop eating processed meat altogether?
Not too much, at least, but you should also indulge in some of your treats, I guess. I'm speaking as a French, you know how food is important for us, and I think it's important to get pleasure and a nice experience from food and drink and so on. But in any case, processed meat are not good, and that's a euphemism, are not good for health. Not only because of the nitrated aspect of it, but also because of the salt, the fat, and the health burden of processed meat is extremely high in Western countries.
So, but is there something like a threshold when you say not too much? Do we know what's not too much, or is like with a cigarette, every additional cigarette is just worse?
It depends on what you're talking about. In terms of carcinogenicity, there's no threshold. Each gram of ham increases the risk of getting colorectal cancer. You cannot say you're safe under a certain limit of processed meat you get. But at the same time, it's a risk. So you never really know what is the chance you get a cancer if you just eat a slice of ham. I think we have to learn how to live in uncertainty.
Yes.
And in that case, sobriety, decency, all these words we have learned to forget about are important, especially in terms of food. So excess is bad, diversity is good. And this is what I try to stick to, I would say, in terms of my own consumption.
Okay. Another practical question popped up when I started my research for this episode. So I quickly asked myself, how do I know if a meat product contains nitrite curing salt? Because sometimes it's explicitly listed, like in German-speaking Switzerland with Nitrite Perkel salts, but more often it's hidden behind those E numbers. So it's E249, 250, 250, 251, and 252, as far as I could see.
Exactly. Yeah.
So these are all nitrite curing salts. Does it matter which one of these numbers is used? That's my first question. And the second one, are there even other forms of hidden nitrite?
Yeah, they are. To answer your first questions, these are not the same compounds. You have nitrite and nitrate. And the worst of it is nitrite.
That's which number?
I didn't check out before I would say 250. And the nature of the salt, potassium or sodium, doesn't matter, basically. But in that case, nitrite is not really a natural compound because it's extremely reactive. And nitrite has been itself considered by the WHO as a J2 compound. J2A, basically.
What does that mean, J2A?
Which is it's probably carcinogenic, which is not the group 1, as you mentioned, from nitrosamine or for processed meat. I wanted to add that processed meat is the only food nutriment that is classified as carcinogenic by WHO. This is the only product that we ingest that is directly carcinogenic without any doubt.
That's mind-blowing, actually.
Yeah, it's worse than tobacco or smoking somehow. The burden in terms of lethality and mortality is not the same, but it's a group 1 compound and product. So nitrite is a group 2A compound, which should also raise certain concerns regarding its use. Well, we're using carcinogenic product in ham, which is really strange, and which is not the case of nitrate so far. But both have been related to an increase in the risk of cancers depending on the amount and the way they were ingested.
And so to my second question, so I listed these E numbers from 249 to 252. Are there other ingredients or numbers that I should know about?
Other numbers than that?
Yes.
No. The fact is that in France, for example, ham's specific type of ham is being sold, which is without nitrite. So perhaps you have that also in Switzerland with a no nitrite ham. So it's a huge, or bacon or whatever. So there's a huge quantity now, I would say 10% of the ham or the bacon that it's without nitrite. But that doesn't mean it's safe. Because in that case, during the process, you're adding natural nitrate coming from vegetables such as cabbages, leeks, beets, and stuff like that are really rich in nitrate, and rich because also we bring a lot of fertilizers in the soil, and so that increase also the amount of nitrate in these vegetables. So instead of using E249 or 250, they're just adding vegetables that already have these compounds within them. And so it's like...
Doesn't it make a difference at all if it's from...
Well, it can, because it's chemistry. And it's biological chemistry, which is a tough one. And in that case, it's different if you're pouring huge amount of nitrite or if you're adding slowly through biological processes, bacteria that are transforming nitrate into nitrite, because this is nitrite that's doing the job in the conservation. This is not nitrate. Nitrite is the biocidal compound that will kill the bacteria in your ham, and that's why the industrials pretend it's a conservative. Not nitrate, but nitrite.
Yes,
nitrate is transformed in nitrite. Sorry, we're going into chemistry.
Yes, and I think we should go there for a moment because we're talking about nitrite, nitrate, and nitrosamines, and these.
Yeah. And I can add a few others if you need.
Well, maybe you can try to give us, for a layperson like me, a quick nitrite biochemistry 101.
Well,
so what
it's a redox. It's an redox, which means oxidative reduction process, which is sharing and giving or taking electrons. Well, nitrate, it's NO3 minus. Nitrite, it's NO2 minus. And in fact, nitrogen is extremely reactive atom, and it creates like a bunch of what we call reactive nitrogen species that include nitrate, nitrite, nitrosamines, but many others. Mm-hmm. And I've been working on one of them, which is NO, nitric oxide for many years, but perhaps you can see the smog in the Zurich atmosphere, which is a little yellow due to pollution through NO2, which is nitrogen dioxide. But you're also using nitrogen protoxide when you in some hospitals as a anesthetic, or even in the food chain when you need to spray different cream or whatever. They use nitrogen protoxide, which is also used as a drug. You have also organic nitrite that you can find in everyday compounds like poppers, amyl nitrite, or also in hospital like trinitrin when you have pectoris angina, which is cardiovascular issues somehow, because that's a vasodilator. So that's a huge family of compounds, and they're all reacting and transforming themselves into one another.
So
So they're
it
not
goes like in
stable.
all directions, right?
It goes in all directions. So when you had nitrate, it goes into nitrite. When you had nitrite, it goes into NO, and so on and so forth. But there's not only one single road. It's like a network of interaction and cross-reaction and transformation. So in the case of the ham, for example, when you had nitrite, let's say in France, 140 milligram per kilo of ham, the nitrite disappears within a few minutes. There's no nitrite anymore. It has transformed into many other compounds, not nitrosamine. It transformed into nitrosamine, but some treatment can get rid of it. But it gives mostly the ham this pink color
Yes.
through this transformation.
So that it looks fresh and tasty.
Well, I don't know. We have learned to think
Yes.
that it is fresh and tasty.
Yes.
But a few decades ago, it was not fresh and tasty. It was only pink. Because when you cook your pork, it doesn't turn pink.
Yeah.
It's gray.
Yeah.
And that's the normal color of cooked meat, such as ham. And that's the same thing with dry ham. It doesn't have to be that flashy red. When you cure the ham only with salt, it's another color that pops up. Basically, if you want to know, to answer your question, if your ham is fit for eating and that you don't risk a colorectal cancer, take it gray. Because that means that no additional nitrogen compounds have been added.
Okay.
And wherever they come. So I would take 3 levels of toxicity. The gray one, I think it's safer. It's the safest. Then the one which is a no nitrite with only vegetable, it's better than a huge amount of nitrite because the chemical biology of it would decrease somehow also the content in terms of bad nitrogen compounds.
And then there's the normal one that's the most dangerous. And I think this no nitrite ham, I haven't seen this in Switzerland. Maybe this is really specific for France, also due to your work. But we might come back to that later. Just to sum it up for me, what's the take-home message of this whole biochemistry chain? So for me, I have the impression it really doesn't matter. I don't have to understand this in detail because whatever is inside there with nitro in it, it can turn into nitrosamines. Is that sort of the take-home message?
Yeah, and I would not mention nitrosamine in it because at the end it might not be the ugly one. You presented it as the primal suspect of the increase in terms of colorectal cancer observed through the consumption of processed meat. That might not be the case. And there are other suspects, such as nitrosyl globins, that give that pink color to the ham, or nitrothiols, or other kind of nitrogen compounds. That may be the compound that's really responsible for the toxicity of the ham. Okay. And if I may add a layer of complexity, it depends also on your diet, what you eat with the ham. It depends on the microbiota in your gut. It's like any kind of disease, but especially cancer, multifactorial. And so it's not only because you eat ham that you get a colorectal cancer. Other factors are in line. And to make it clear, I would say nitrite is considered, as I said, as a G2A compound, probably carcinogenic, but the cancer it's related to, it's a gastric cancer.
Yes.
which is the upper part of the gastrointestinal tract, because it directly reacts in this condition of the stomach and the esophagus to transform into nitrosamine in that case.
Okay.
And that leads to the carcinogenicity. That's not the case of ham, because we're speaking about colorectal cancer, which is at the bottom, at the end of the gastrointestinal tract, which means that during the digestive process, those compounds have been transformed.
Yes.
And not only they are transformed in the ham, but they are also transformed through the digestion. And we know that the environment, the physical, chemical, biological, microbial environment through the gut is completely different. Anoxic, hypoxic, oxygenated, and so on and so forth. So we have no clue, I would say, right now. We have some suspects, some hints and ideas about what could go on in the gut, but we lack of information of the story of your gut, what's really happening when you eat a slice of ham. And we'll never get it. It's too complex. So what is important is the common sense, to answer your question. And in that case, when you know it's toxic, you should just rely on your common sense. You don't need to understand the exact biochemistry of it. You just have to listen to the early warnings and be cautious. And knowledge is not a requisite here. The full knowledge is not a requisite. It's like a hobby for biochemists like me, but it's not a requisite for you in terms of how you should behave.
Yes. If I know it's toxic, I just would try to avoid it or at
Exactly.
least reduce the consumption. So we can leave that biochemistry part for now, maybe jump into the history of how this evolved, right? Because people have been curing meat with salt for centuries, and the meat industry often uses this as an argument, claiming it's a traditional method, something we've been doing for a long time. Is that historically accurate, or was the salt we used for preservation different in the past?
It was, because I will hint your listener to two series of books by Guillaume Coudray about the story of conservation and the use of nitrite or nitrate additives in conservation of processed meat. And one of it is called cochonnerie, which is like a word game with the name cochon, well, for the French listener, I would say.
Yeah, in German it also works with Schweinerei. I don't know how to translate that
that might
to
be the
English.
same. It's a Schweinerei. And the idea is that where we have been eating meat, pork meat especially, for thousands of years. And nitrite itself appears in the history of mankind in the early 20th century in terms of industrial production, and in terms of scientific knowledge, I would say the end of the 18th century. But as I said, nitrite is not a stable compound, a natural compound. You don't find nitrite on Earth that easily. You find nitrate. In French, it's called salpêtre. And you can find also nitrate in organic compounds, and especially in feces of animals or decomposing matter. So that's a natural compound. So at one point, nitrate has been used as a conservative of meat pork, but it has been industrialized by the meat packers in Chicago during the 19th century. Because when you preserve pork, you need to do that in cold winter. That's where you kill the pig, basically, and you make the processed meat, at least in Corsica, where I'm coming from. And in that case, the window is really short. And you have to process it in really cold conditions to avoid the growth of bacteria. And nitrate and then nitrite provided a way to speed up the process.
To make it more efficient?
More efficient, and you can use it through the whole year. It didn't need to be done in careful conditions. It's like using a bazooka to kill a mosquito, basically. You had a huge power of destroying the bacteria using nitrate and nitrite, and that was somehow a really magic tool, because you could really increase the production, lower the cost, and make a lot of people rich. And then Fritz Haber came. And Fritz Haber, it's a German chemist who, for other reasons, was trying to find a way to synthesize ammoniac. NH3, another nitrogen compound, which is the basis of fertilizers. And there was a crisis in fertilizers at the end of the 19th century because the new type of agriculture required a lot of entrants of fertilizers, and there were no place to be found because all the nitrate owners was already used, and it led to the guano wars because guano was even more expensive than gold at that time. So basically, Fritz Haber found a way to produce ammonium nitrate, and it led to the production of nitrite. So the processed meat industry found a new way to use, at really even lower cost, this new compound in the processed meat. And so it was adopted in the 1920s, despite the fact that nitrite was a poison.
Yes, maybe just to open a quick gap, this fix also did a good job because it made the meat safe in terms of why do we need the curing in the first place, right? Can you maybe say something about the danger of botulism? Or I mean,
no, botulism. It's a fake news.
So why do we use it? I mean, for the basics, right? What happened? What would happen if we didn't?
Because you know that if you leave milk, egg, meat on your table for a few days, a lot of bugs, a lot of new living organisms will benefit from this food source and will grow on it. Some are just disgusting, or some are good because a lot of processing are using this kind of microbes like cheese, yogurt. So bacteria by themselves are not bad, but some of the bacteria may be toxic. Botulism is one of it, but I would not say it's the major health preoccupation, but Listeria, Salmonella, and other gastrointestinal bacteria, basically, that create gastrointestinal crisis, are toxic. And so people were looking for ways to conserve meat for months. Also for the jointure, when you had less meat, and so you have to stock them. You have to stock the meat, and salt was used because there's no water and bacteria need water to grow, but also fat, sugar. So there were a lot, or vinegar. There are different ways to process these food to preserve them. And when the industrial production came, they were looking for industrial ways to preserve the food. And these chemical compounds were a huge opportunity for them.
So can you maybe say something about, how this new fix was introduced? Because you mentioned before it was used despite it's known as a toxic, right? You can even kill people.
Yeah, that's fun.
So how did that evolve?
As I say, nitrite is known to be a poison before being carcinogenic.
And it was already known back then, right?
Yeah, in the 19th century. That was used to kill your husband or wife. And it's known, basically, this nitrate-nitrite toxicity phenomenon called methemoglobinemia, or the blue baby disease, which is that when you prepare I don't have the name in English, but in French it's biberon, but the processed milk, basically, you put in a bottle with dried industrial milk, and you add water. If there is nitrate and nitrite in this water, it will kill the baby because it will kill the oxygen in his blood.
Yes.
And in that case, his blood turns blue, and he dies from asphyxia, basically. And that's why nitrite is poisonous.
And so there was, we could say, a poison added to the meat?
Yeah.
Weren't there any objections?
Of course, there was. It's, I think, an illusion to believe that the technological progress was accepted with euphoria by the population. In general, there was a lot of resistance to any kind of technological process. And in that case, the resistance came from the physician, because they knew it was a danger for the health of the people. The organization of the physician opposed during a long time to the use of nitrite in the USA, but at the end it was accepted in the turn of, as I said, the 1920s by the US government. But it took longer to come in Europe. and it was only accepted in Europe in the early 60s with the construction of the European community.
So before there weren't any nitrites used in European cured
Not
meat?
nitrite. There might have been nitrate, but no nitrite. No nitrite before the 60s. And there might have been nitrate from old processes, but no nitrite. So that was creating a commercial advantage for the US producers of processed meat. And so for economical reason and basically economical competition, nitrite was accepted in the 60s. But it's exactly at the same time that another aspect of nitrite emerges, which is its carcinogenicity. In the 50s, 60s, like in the tobacco story, nitrosamine came up in the 50s, 60s because of smoking.
Okay.
And so the carcinogenicity of smoking was also related to nitrogen compounds. And so scientists at that period end up finding that nitrite was toxic and carcinogenic. But we forgot. And it took 50 years for the story to come back in the public space.
So is it just that we forgot? In the case of tobacco, we know that such findings were suppressed quite actively. Do you know what happened?
Well, there has not been clear investigation on the lobbying of processed meat company in the 70s, 80s, in the USA in particular. But we know that in the 70s, the authorities were keen to forbid the use of nitrite. But in 1980, Ronald Reagan got elected. And his first surgeon was the president of the American Meat Institute. All these preoccupations, warnings about the toxicity of nitrite vanishes.
So let's talk about alternative, right? When I learned that because of new scientific evidence, the Parma Ham Association decided to produce their products without any nitrite curing salts since as early as 1993. So clearly it's possible to make a safe, delicious, and profitable cold cut without nitrites.
Yeah.
So would you say this is a safe one, the Parma Ham?
It's as safe as it was, as I told you 100 years ago.
Yeah.
The question of safety is really touchy because many of the disease, if you eat 1 kilo of Parma ham a day, you will get sick.
Of course.
But it's clearly safer.
So how do they do it? I mean, is nitrite curing just unnecessary?
Traditionally, they dry it. You speak about dry ham in the case of Parma ham.
Yes.
Okay, they dry it.
And that's it.
With salt. And that's the way
and it just takes longer.
Dry ham was produced. So you don't have to add specific additional conservatives in that case, or nitrated conservatives in that case.
But so that method wouldn't work for all charcuterie, etc.
The cooked ham, no, you cannot dry it. And the problem with the cooked ham is after basically the process. Once it's cooked, you kill all the bacteria. But the question is the conservation afterwards, which is not the case for the dry ham because it's dry. As I said, there's no much water for anything to grow on it. And in that case, in the cooked ham, the main concern would be Listeria, for example, which is an opportunistic bacteria that can just come from everywhere, a knife that you use to cut the ham or whatever. And then the Listeria grow, and after a certain threshold, it becomes dangerous for people, especially immunodepressed people.
Yeah, okay. You mentioned earlier that it was forgotten for 50 years. So I wonder, how did you, as a researcher, become interested in the topic of nitrite?
Well, it was an accident, I would say, because I didn't even know that the companies were using nitrite in the ham. Well, I'm not a big ham eater at first. And
you still are, though?
I prefer saucisson.
Okay.
Like sausages.
Okay.
But ham, it's not my... Well, that's the same thing for sausages. But let's say I was first involved as whistleblower in the fight against plastic used in food contact material. And in that case, we succeeded in France in getting all plastic banned from food catering for kids both in school, in hospitals, and that was a huge victory at that point. And I was confronted to massive lobbying from chemical companies, French or European ones at that time. And so I started to interact with scientists, journalists, or whistleblowers confronted also to this kind of misinformation, disinformation, influence. And through these different encounters, I stepped on Guillaume Coudray, who is the journalist that
That's the one with
was.
Gauchenerie, right? I
Yeah,
think we will put
exactly.
his book in the show
Yeah, you
notes.
have to,
Yeah.
because he was the real one to start to reintroduce this health and food scandal in the public space. And so I just discovered, discussing with him, that nitrite was used in food. And in my lab, nitrite is in a small vial that's sealed and that's stored in a safe lock with 2 keys so that you cannot use it. And not kilos of nitrite, but a few grams, because a few grams is enough to kill yourself. In that case, I was not understanding that you were using, or that companies, processed meat companies, were using nitrite, whereas in my case, it was considered in my lab as a really dangerous compound. I read Guillaume books, and at the same time, there was some kind of political initiative to question the use of nitrite in the processed meat industry that was basically launched by parliamentary named Ramos from the right-wing part of the French National Parliament. And it tried to push a few laws to tax or to ban or whatever could prevent the use of nitrite in processed meat, but it failed.
Which year are we talking about?
We are in 2017, 2018,
Okay.
2019, the ANSES evaluation and the French government planned on nitrite. So it's pretty recent. I know that in the USA, the American Meat Institute was extremely active to prevent the science to come up on the carcinogenicity of nitrite. So there was a huge lobbying by the American Meat Institute to defend its interest and the use of nitrite. But that was not the case in France. So that's why there are some kind of unions, processed meat industry union, but they were not really concerned at first by questionings about the use of nitrite. It came up late, basically. And when it came, it was extremely massive, and it was made public directly, and so it became directly a public concern.
So it was in the press and like
In the press, in the
public
newspaper,
discussion.
but also, as I said, in the French parliament. So that was a matter of debate. And this is why, at the end, under the pressure of this deputy, Ramos, the government decided to make an expertise on nitrite in processed meat.
And you were one of those experts on this working group?
Yep.
And so you gave advice for the regulatory policy. What did you achieve? What's the status now? And so how has regulation changed in France?
It hasn't.
Oh, it hasn't.
And this evaluation, this expertise was a huge failure. And to complete this picture, I quit after a year and a half because I found it was a fake evaluation. And that's an opinion. I felt that the ANSES was just laundering, greenwashing or science washing a political decision that has been already made.
The ANSES, you have to.
The ANSES is the regulatory agency that achieved the expertise.
What does it stand for, the abbreviation?
C'est l'Agence nationale de sécurité de l'environnement. Well, they make all regulations. It's like the EFSA, the French EFSA, the European Food Safety Agency.
Yeah.
But ANSES has also an expertise and regulation mandate on ecological, but also work health.
So your impression was that they weren't really sincere?
Oh, no, yeah. Well, it's complex because lobbying and laundering, well, it took a lot of years, as you said, to understand what was going on in the tobacco industry because it's not that clear. It's also extremely complex when you come to PFAS, for
Mm.
example, the polyfluoroalkyls. And so the ways of influence is extremely complex, and it's always a surprise when you stumble on them. And in my case, it was both systemic failure of an agency that is not fit to do this kind of work and political influence upon the agency to get the kind of advice they were needed.
So, but nothing has changed because I had the impression before that France was sort of at a different point than Switzerland because you have these.
Nothing has changed significantly. There have been a nitrite plan, but that only slightly modified the limit of nitrite use. So it's they decrease the limits of nitrite use, but
By what?
it's 10% to 10, 20 milligrams. But it doesn't change anything on the color of your ham or its toxicity, basically. So it's purely symbolic, in my opinion. And the reason I left, the reason I quit, was also an epistemological one. You remember at the beginning of the interview, I spoke about this family of compounds that were always interacting with each other, transforming themselves. And I said that once you had nitrite on the ham, it vanishes. It transforms into
Yes.
something else. So how do you achieve a toxicological evaluation of a product that has disappeared?
Yeah.
And I tried to push the knowledge that it was not the nitrite per se that was the issue, the problem, but all these nitrogen compounds that form, evolve in your gut, in the ham, and eventually become toxic. But the ANSYS decided to go on with traditional expertise, like you take rats and you had nitrite in their food and you see what's going on, and it's not the same thing. If you had nitrite in water or in ham or in your gut, the outcome will be completely different. So you cannot use traditional toxicological evaluation to assess the risk of processed meat consumption by humans. But this is still what they were entitled to do. It is the only things that they know they can do. So they didn't want to say, we're not fit to do this kind of evaluation. They didn't want to say that the regulatory toxicology was obsolete, but it has been for decades to assess toxicological risk, especially in food. So they wanted to keep the business as usual and do some kind of evaluation that was wrongly reassuring the people. Because, well, you say processed meat, and the ANSYS, this agency, at least confirmed that which was known for decades, that processed meat is carcinogenic and that it's linked to the use of nitrite. But they didn't focus on nitrite. And they say, well, there's no nitrite in the ham, and nitrite per se is not carcinogenic, so there's no problem. So you start with a problem, which is processed meat, when you use nitrite, is carcinogenic. And at the end, you stated that, well, but there's no nitrite anymore. And even if there were, nitrite is not that bad. So it was like a nightmare.
I see. So, but what would be your suggestion if you could choose, if you could define the rules? What would you suggest?
Well, I've been thinking about that a lot because for me it was a huge blow in terms of what science can do to fight for the common good. And this failure was really worrisome for me. So I felt I had to think about how I would achieve an expertise on nitrite if I were the Minister of Health, for example. And so in Sciences Citoyennes that you mentioned earlier, there are a lot of good and interesting people, and especially there is this Belgian philosopher, Isabelle Stengers, science philosopher, which is, I think, the best science philosopher, living science philosopher right now. And she is the honor president of Sciences Citoyennes. And I started to discuss a lot with her about these questions, and we are trying to elaborate a new way of achieving expertise in scientific controversies. And this kind of expertise, which you could call citizen expertise, but that's not really the aim of it, is really to articulate different knowledge, different types of knowledge, not only academic knowledge, but also profane, traditional, experiential knowledge, and to deliver a kind of process that help scientists like me to give their best, I would say, which is try to make sense of a situation and try to come up with not solutions, because I don't believe in this word, but at least informations or concepts or recommendations that would help the general population.
So, but if you could formulate such a recommendation, what would you do? I mean, would you say you would prohibit the use of these
No.
compounds, or what would be a way forward?
Well, I go back to Fritz Haber, the guy who synthesized ammonium nitrate. And because of him, or thanks to him, we are now 8 billion people on this planet. Without the Haber-Bosch process, we would not have been able to engage in the green revolution and feed that many people. But there's a lot of externalities, a lot of bad sides of this use. There are more bad sides. I don't enter into the details, but there are more bad sides of the use of nitrate in the Haber-Bosch process than good aspects of it. But we can turn the pipe off. Otherwise, billions of people would die.
So
We can stop the production of fertilization with a snap. It doesn't work like this. And that's the same thing when you're facing this kind of health scandal. You cannot just stop completely processing meat.
that's why I ask.
And so it has to be some kind of process that not only relates to the use of additives, but concerns, engage all the food habits, the food organization, the food logistics from different dimensions, the social, cultural, technical, scientific dimensions. And so it has to be a kind of revolution in the way we eat. A revolution that is not only limited to ham consumption, but to meat, to vegetables, and so on and so forth.
And it couldn't be just done by one specific law, right?
Yeah, and one specific actor.
Yeah.
So in that case, for example, just taking an example, you use nitrite, especially in packages of ham with 10, 20 slices, because when you open the packages, you don't eat the ham within 1 or 2 days. It stays in your fridge for a longer time, and that's this stay that is dangerous, because at that point that the bacteria grow. Okay, so you use belt and you use all the means to avoid this growth, and so you had a lot of nitrite. But let's say you just sell by packages or 1 or 2 slices. They eat once you open the package. And let's say you just buy your ham at your grocery store or your boucher charcutier in your neighborhood. It's safe. In that case, it's not only a question of the type of additives you're using, but on the way you're processing the meat, on the way you're transporting the meat, eating the meat, and so on and so forth. And if you don't change this kind of habit, you will just find a bad fix, and you will replace nitrite by another stuff that might not be better than nitrite.
For the end of this episode, let me try to maybe sort of adopt a more global perspective. You know, that's a very illustrative example, but maybe can we learn something from this, like in general, about regulatory politics, or why do we seem to fail to adopt policies that protect the health and the environment?
Wow.
Maybe it's too
That's a
big of a
huge
question.
that's a huge question. Well, there are many things to learn, and at least I did learn a lot of things from this experience. I think we had a bad connection between science and policies, between the scientific and the political fields, but not only in the case of nitrite, not only in the last 50 years, but in my thinking for centuries. And I would say since the emergence of modern science. And so I felt a lot of scientific knowledge has been used to push a civilization project, a societal project that we are witnessing the limits of right now. Ham is one aspect of it. We felt that in the early 20th century, it was a magic tool, that this technological, chemical, because it's also technological, but this chemical advances was really useful for society and to feed people. Same thing with nitrite, the ammonium nitrate. And we decided at that time not to see the negative aspects of it. We already saw some, and some others were still unseen, but we didn't want to look for them. And so we invented a story about progress, about happiness, about growth, about, I would say, the success of this modern society based on a lie, which is that science and technology were only useful for mankind.
So, is there anything that keeps you hopeful about continuing the fight for better regulations, or what keeps you going, right?
Well, first, because I'm a scientist, and I think knowledge is a good thing. But knowledge is a word, and it depends what you put in it. In French, we have two words basically: knowledge and understanding, la connaissance. Knowledge is a good thing, but understanding is a better one. And the problem of science somehow is that it has focused of explaining. So the knowledge is a really abstract one that doesn't care much about the real world, despite its initial project. And especially in biology, we have more and more data, more and more explanations, but less and less understanding. And that's a real issue. So, as a scientist, I felt that we have to reinvest the way we produce knowledge so that this knowledge provides understanding and just not helps us for career or to get grants or to find some good positions in any kind of institutions. What we are entitled to is provide understanding to the general population about the crisis they are facing themselves, and especially the most vulnerable of them. In the case of ham, the people who buy the 10, 20 sliced packages are not the richest one. They are the most vulnerable one. And so I think we have to rethink the way we produce knowledge. That's one point. And the other thing that makes me confident is that we will never avoid the catastrophe, because this is not something that we can avoid. Catastrophe is a normal, necessary thing that we have to go through. And you learn a lot from this experience. And not only you learn, but it allows you to reconfigure your relation to the world, to the knowledge, and it gives you the possibility to invent new stories, new ways of making science, but also living in this planet. I think not only science should be armed to provide understanding, but also to go through these kind of experiences that we are afraid of, but that somehow the common human condition.
Thank you so much for expanding my understanding and that of our audience and for coming to the show. Thank you so much, Jérôme.
Thank you, Thomas.
In 2 weeks, we will talk with Christine von Weizsäcker about the Technofix narrative, what it is, where it came from, and who it benefits. Beyond the Fix is brought to you by Critical Scientists Switzerland, an independent network of Swiss researchers, and is made possible by the Stiftung Mercator Schweiz. Music by Mich Gerber.